This is episode number 60, featuring Morgan Weistling. Welcome to the PleinAir podcast from PleinAir magazine. I'm your host, Eric Rhodes, publisher and founder of PleinAir magazine. In the PleinAir podcast, we dive deeply into the world of outdoor painting called PleinAir painting, and that's French, essentially, for outdoors or in the open air. The French say plein, others say plain. It doesn't matter how you say it. It's a movement of artists around the world going outdoors to paint. That's what this show's all about. The podcast is brought to you by the PleinAir convention coming up in Santa Fe. We're going to have well over 1,000 people this year. It's going to be our biggest and best yet. Some amazing people going to be teaching. We teach indoors and then we go outdoors and paint together. It's quite a phenomenon. We're there for several days. Check it out at PleinAirConvention.com. It's also brought to you by the PleinAir Salon Art Competition. We have a $15,000 grand prize and about $32,000 in cash prizes. Enter your best paintings at PleinAirSalon.com. Well, it's my desire to see more people fall in love with plein air painting. You can help by sharing this podcast with your friends. We're up to, I think, 158,000 listeners now, 18,000 per episode. Took a big leap this year. We were, last time I checked, at 5,000, so that's really huge. Thank you for making this happen. If you have feedback, Eric at PleinAirMagazine.com. And let's get right to our interview with Morgan Weistling. Well, we have Morgan Weistling on the line. Morgan, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
At this moment in time when we're talking, you're in Southern California, and there have been some fires all around you. Now, by the time this gets published, let's hope they're all out. But what's that like, living in the midst of those fires?
Well, it's not fun. Being evacuated is definitely not a fun thing to do. We had to do it last year. This time around, we didn't have to, but having to throw your entire life into your cars in the scope of about 45 minutes, if I'm not going to have a heart attack, then hopefully that will mean I'll never have one, because my heart never pounded so hard.
Oh, I can't imagine that. I guess it makes you now think in advance about the next time.
Yeah, it always makes you do things like, I'm never going to do that again. So I went out and bought a fire hose pump that runs on gasoline, because we have a swimming pool, and I said, I will never go through this again. I am going to stay, and I'll be able to just use, this gigantic pool full of water. And so the fire we had after that, I was so prepared, and I go to attach the hose, and the hose was split.
Oh, no.
Oh, God. Okay, let's all get in the cars and leave again.
That's why they make duct tape, or that stuff they advertise on TV. So I thought this would be an interesting discussion to have, because you are a plein air painter, but nobody really knows that about you. You're kind of mostly well known as one of the preeminent Western painters on the circuit with the Great Western shows, and have been doing that for a number of years.
About 18 years.
18 years?
Yeah.
All right. So I want to kind of talk about your career and how you've built such a magnificent career. But why don't we start with how this all began? What are your first memories of art as a child?
Well, I've told this story. I feel like everyone's tired of it. But, my dad and my mom met in art school. He started teaching me to communicate through pictures when I was 1, and he would sit me on his lap at night, and we would draw together, and it was one of those things that was just part of the natural fabric of the family. And if I had established at the table that I wanted to be a doctor, I probably, would have been yelled at. Everybody wanted me to be an artist, so it was just a normal thing in our family to say that you're going to be an artist someday. So it was just a natural thing. He had art books. I had things, always being encouraged to read, and I had a family that that was constantly checking to make sure I was studying my anatomy when I wasn't even getting my homework done. But it was more important that I studied my anatomy. So that's what I grew up in, and so I've just lived it my whole life. And there was never a moment when I said, "Oh, I'm going to be an artist." It was more, what kind of an artist was I going to be?
Oh, that's
that was
interesting.
my only question. And there was a lot of things I had to go through to finally figure that out.
So, like what? What did you go through?
Well, the first thing was I very practical all my life, which was, how am I going to make a living? Like, what will be a great way for an artist to make a living? And the first thing when you're a kid is animation. And I figured, well, it would be great to be able to say I'm a Disney animator or something like that. So I took an animation class, and my parents were always encouraged that they would always sign me up whatever I wanted to take. And I made a little animated movie. I hand drew each, I can't remember how many hundreds of drawings. And then I got to finally watch it in class, and it was about 10 seconds long, maybe. And I said, screw this.
Yeah, too much work.
It's just not worth it.
Yeah.
So I just literally at that moment said, I'm not going to do this anymore. And then my mom would look out for other classes for me and stuff. And that's when I was 15 is when it really was established that what it is I wanted to do, and that was be an illustrator. And the only reason I made that decision is because I found a teacher who was an old-time illustrator from the way back days, and I immediately fell in love with everything he taught me, and about the history of illustration and Howard Pyle to everybody else, and it just was my love from that point on.
Now, was that Fixler that taught you illustration?
Yeah, Fred Fixler.
Yeah. And didn't he study with Frank Riley?
He studied with Frank Riley. His roommate was James Bama, and Dean Cornwell would come in often and take over the class. And I mean, to us sitting around listening to his stories, it was just like, like a fantasy, what his schooling was like. And so that's what we were, fed on, just literally those stories and what it was like to be a student of Frank Riley.
Well, we share that in common because my mentor, the person who taught me to paint, studied with Riley as well, along with some others. So that's cool.
Who was that? Who was that?
Pardon me?
What was his name?
His name was Jack Jackson. Nobody's ever heard of him. He's dead now.
No,
but
I haven't heard of him. Okay.
Yeah, but he did good things for me. So the Western art genre eventually came about. Was that from illustration? Did you actually get work in illustration, or how did this all come about?
Well, for 14 years, I was a movie poster illustrator.
Really?
Yeah, I did movie posters for 14 years. I was 19 years old, fresh out of studying with Fred, and was working at an art store, and Drew Struzan came in, a big-time movie poster illustrator. And I always kept some of my school drawings behind the counter in case there was someone important that might come in. And I showed him my drawings, and the next day I got a phone call from the top agency in the movie poster industry and said, "We've been told we need to hire you." And so I went from 15 an hour to a lot more an hour overnight. And so that was my life for 14 years of just doing mostly entertainment-related movie posters, pinball games, any kind of artwork for anything related to the movie industry.
So did you pull out of that about the time when the computer started taking over?
Yes. That was the catalyst for why I started realizing that I needed to think about what I thought was going to be my life later on, which would be fine art. I started thinking about it a lot sooner. And so I did a painting. I went to Scottsdale, Arizona, and I walked into the first gallery that I was told to walk into, and they took it. And things aren't as easy as they were, back then.
No, nothing's easy. In some ways things are easier, but other ways not. And that's one of the ways it's not so much easier. So,
no.
And was that a Western painting that you had done?
It was a figurative painting, more of a genre painting. I've always painted, in my mind, it was when I was going to do these kinds of paintings, because I had been planning out ideas for paintings that when I get older, I will do. So I pulled some of those sketches out, and I did one of those ideas of a couple kids, inside of a kind of an old world, interior, and just wanted to display my abilities to draw feet and hands and the figure, and people flipped, they loved it, and I thought, well, I could do this. And so I had a million ideas already about what I wanted to do, sort of create a world of this old world quality, which ended up being the late 1800s in the Western genre. But I don't do your typical, usual, cowboys on horses or anything like that. I've always been more about storytelling with the behind the scenes of what was going on. I was always interested in those stories of what was going on behind the big cowboy scenes, but like the women and children were always more important to me in the beginning of what kind of stories those pioneers had to tell, and so that's where it all started.
And the first thing that I wondered about is this something that do you ever find yourself saying, I pigeonholed myself into this area, and wouldn't it be fun to do a real contemporary painting of something in a modern scene? Or is this something that kind of resonates in your soul of this is just who I am and this is what I want to do?
Yeah, people always ask that question. I think it's like the first thing that everyone always thinks of is like, do you like having to always paint this particular time period? And I often think about it. Well, if I wasn't pigeonholed into this, what would excite me? And I can't think of it. I'm not excited by tank tops and flip flops, iPhones, and all those other things. I guess I'm more interested in photographing those things. Like if I was a photographer, to catalog what's going on in the world right now.
Yeah.
But as a painter, I love lamplight. And I love beautiful, soft light coming through a hazy window, and I love the old feel of clothing that's been hand sewn, and it's just part of my soul. That's what I love, and I probably should have lived back then, and that's why I like shoes that they're worn and old and dented and scratched, and that's what I love. So there's really nothing that turns me on in this world that I'd say, oh, I'd love to just be painting whatever. I can't even think of what I would paint right now.
Well, that's neat that you're into it, and you do such a beautiful job. I'm curious about multi-figure paintings because, quite frankly, it's not something you see a lot of anymore, and it's very complicated. You plan these things out on a sketch pad before you bring models in and kind of come up with a concept, or are you even using models?
Yeah, no. Well, first of all, that goes back to my training as an illustrator. That's where I'm able to do these things without really thinking that they're like a big deal to come up with something that has 26 figures in it, like the wedding dance one I did or something. I've studied Edwin Austin Abbey and all these guys, and that's the stuff I just always, wish I could do something with a lot of figures like that. So this is my chance now to do some of that. But as an illustrator, you learn how to conceive an idea, and you figure it out, what design you want to fit it into, and then, you start acting like a movie director, a movie producer, a location scout. I always say it's like putting a movie together, only I'm only going to film one frame of it.
Right.
and I've got to tell the whole story in this one single frame. And that is not easy, and it's exhausting to try and figure out how to tell that story with all those pieces put together. And if it's ever successful, it's really satisfying. And when it's not, it's a lot of work for nothing. But it's always worth it if it comes out and it works out and people like it. But it starts with a conceptual little scribble, and then it just has to keep, expanding out. Just finding models that tell the story you're wanting to tell takes forever.
Yeah.
Because I don't just use the same models over and over again. I'm always looking, always. Then I got to approach strangers in the supermarket. I'm sorry, but you kind of look like a snake oil salesman. Could you possibly pose for me? And then, I have to explain what I do and all of that. So it's a crazy life that I'm constantly approaching strangers, and they look like I'm a creep, and then I have to, do a sales job on myself just so they'll pose for me.
I did that one time. There was this really weird looking girl in the gym. She had this bright pink hair, and I thought I would love to paint that girl with that bright pink hair. So I approached her and I told the story, and she looked at me like, this is the weirdest come online I've ever. So she didn't. So I know what you're doing there. I think that's interesting. So what's the difference? Where's that line drawn between illustration and fine art? Because we've had this issue, back when I first got into the art business, there was this debate about Rockwell. Was Rockwell an illustrator or was he a fine artist? And, there are still people who will not accept Rockwell as a fine artist, and yet, of course, he's very collectible and very popular. Is there a difference between what you did as an illustrator and what you do as a fine artist, or is it all really just about storytelling in the same way?
Well, there is a difference in my mind, but you can't control how other people feel about what they think is what you have to define what is fine art, and I don't think we have time to try to figure that one out. But really, for me, if Rockwell was not a fine artist, then fine, but either is Howard Turpney. Because I don't see the difference. Right. I don't see the difference. He's a storyteller, so was Rockwell. Is it because Rockwell had, harder edges or something? I don't know. But when it comes down to it, I think Rockwell produced tons of beautiful paintings that work as what we would call fine art, hang-on-the-wall paintings. Maybe the more comedic stuff you could say is a little too cartoony to be called serious, maybe. But I've never worried about that thinking too much. Otherwise, it would really screw you up and eliminate maybe some good ideas because you're so worried about is it something that's fine art or not. I think when it comes down to it, for me, when I was starting out, I said to myself, I might be kind of a corny person in general. I have a corny personality. I'm not, sophisticated. I like silly ideas, and sometimes they may come out in my paintings, but I am going to approach these ideas the same way I would anything else, which is I'm just painting light. I'm only painting light. Once I've kind of got my idea figured out, I don't think about it ever again. I just sit there and paint light. I'm separating the light from the shadow. I'm trying to get good hard and soft edge contrast where, I've got one spot, just the hardest edge. I'm trying to get a nice design where I've got a full value range, or my massing of all the darks are here and I want all the lights here. And I'm just thinking like an artist. I'm not trying to, continue to figure out how I can make this more and more cute. It's just paint the light. And when people look at the painting, if they feel a sense of mood through the light, it's successful for me as a fine art painting.
Well, I'd like to shift gears for a second and move into the plein air world. You are not known as a landscape painter, clearly, but you have a lot of landscapes in your art. I'm looking at your website as we speak, and you have, as someone who is a landscape painter, you have some absolutely phenomenal landscapes, and it's very well developed. Tell me about how you have gone through your process of learning the landscape and how you use plein air in your own world.
I've always been a plein air painter, if that's a label that one gives oneself. But I've never wanted to establish myself to the world that I'm a plein air painter, because then I'm expected to show you what I do. And it's one of those things where I enjoy plein air painting because it's my little joy of not having to worry while I'm out there. So when I do a lot of my plein air painting, just for the fun of it, I love the idea that this isn't where I'm making my living. This isn't something I have, because I'm kind of a high profile in the area that I'm in. I'm kind of high profile. So if I just like show everything I do, it's like, is this for sale, or what, how much are you going to ask for these? And I don't even want to think about it. I just want to enjoy the process of being out there and trying to get the anatomy of the landscape out there. And when I'm trying to do a painting that has landscape in it, I love to go out and do my field sketches to, again, feel the anatomy of what's going on out there and not get caught up in detail, so that when I'm back in the studio, I keep that all in front of me going, okay, don't get caught up, remember how it felt. And that's what I use them for professionally, for that kind of reason. Again, I still don't show them because I've always felt inferior to what I consider the guys out there, or the people out there doing it. They have something to say through just the plein air paintings alone, whereas I've always sort of been, for me, just a catalyst for the final thing I'm going to do.
Well, I think this is an important distinction, because there's this sense out there that a lot of people do plein air painting because that's how they're going to make their living, and I would submit that probably more people are just doing it as a hobby or as enjoyment or recreation than those who are going to try to make a living of it. And here you are, somebody who makes a living as a painter, and you're doing it really for enjoyment, for your own personal pleasure, which is kind of refreshing.
Yeah, I guess it's a luxury I have of being able to do a hobby as an artist. That's some aspect of art that's still pure in some ways for me. It's untouched by having to worry about, will it sell?
And are there any particular inspirations that did you learn when you were doing initial plein air work? Did you learn under anybody? I know you have some buddies that you kind of grew up with that in your area that you went out with on occasion. But
yeah, no, we did all the time. When we were in art school together, it was like you had to go out all the time, and we would go to cemeteries, anywhere, just to paint whatever's in front of us. We had that idea that Sargent had, which was just be able to just drop your easel and paint whatever you see in front of you. No preconceived idea. And so we would do that to test ourselves. It was always a test. Can you capture what you see? And so we did that, and that was, something that stayed with me my whole life, which is that idea of it's a challenge every time you go out. And then I've studied, I have my own particular loves of who I like landscapes of, and so that's actually detrimental sometimes. I found that to be a problem. Also, why I don't show my landscapes, because sometimes I'll do a landscape because I'll be so infatuated with something that I'm doing, and I end up, the reason I liked it is because it looks like something Matt Smith would do, and I'm like, oh man, I'm just copying what Matt Smith would do. I can't show this to anybody. Or Clyde Assevig or George Carlson, whatever I'm out there, I love looking. That's another thing, is I love landscape painters because I don't do it. I love what they do, and it's almost like I hate even trying to go down that road of, because how much influence I must have in me that I love those painters so much that I'm afraid to even do it publicly, because I'm sure you would look at it and say, oh, wow, he really, he really was studying Assevig a lot that day,
Well, you have to aspire to something, I suppose, when you're learning. It's nice to have somebody to learn from. Did you ever go and when you were in art school or otherwise, did you go and copy paintings in museums to try to get?
I never did. I know people do it all the time and still do, and I never never felt the need to do that for some reason. I copied paintings from the books I had. I have such a vast number of books from the time I was in art school that I would sit and just copy. I guess I never really liked the idea of being out in public, having to answer questions and do all that. And
So you're a bit of a hermit. You're living in the.
I'm a hermit.
1800s.
Anybody will tell you I'm a hermit. Yeah, yeah.
So perhaps sometimes we like to impart some wisdom on people who are being inspired by you, who are learning to paint. You had the benefit of growing up in an art family and having it around you all the time, but you probably are asked this question a lot in terms of if you were giving somebody advice on how to kind of figure out all of this on their own, what advice would you give them?
Well, first off, it's really not that hard anymore. There's so much material available that I never had access to. I mean, you could just name an artist you like, and then you probably could find a video, online to watch. So there's just so much self-study ability. You can immediately in a few seconds find something that you could start studying. But I would caution everybody that when they're doing that, when you're starting out, that you expose yourself to just the best. That's all I would say is just, don't just listen to everybody, but pick someone you can say, I really like their work and trust. And if there's somebody that has any materials out or gives workshops, and you just go, I'm going to listen to them, but try to, stay focused for a while on what they have to say rather than listening to some contradictory type things. That's probably the thing I notice when I do give a workshop. The biggest problem I find with my students, especially the beginner ones, is they've already had exposure to a lot of things, and they're so confused because there's so many different approaches. And there's not one I'm ever going to say is the right approach. Mine isn't the right approach. It's my approach. But, you're going to be confused because I probably will contradict a lot of what you've already learned. So that's the thing to try to watch out for is kind of just for a while stick with one train of thought, and you'll see a lot more progress a lot quicker than if you try to expose yourself to a ton of things all at once.
I wish I had that advice about 20 years ago. I think that's great advice. I made the mistake of studying under 2 or 3 different people at one time, and they were all different, and they were all wonderful, but it was very confusing. And it was not until I stabilized on one mentor and just said, I'm going to stick with this one mentor for a long period of time, and I'm going to, not keep changing out my palette. I have this problem. We do all these art videos, and I get to spend time watching these people paint and painting with them, and every time I'd go to an art video shoot, I'd change my palette. And finally, I said, I can't do that anymore because you cannot stabilize on anything. So I appreciate your advice. I wish you'd called me 20 years ago. Obviously, your foundations would be what? Drawing first, painting second. What would you tell people their course should be if you were going to push them in one particular direction?
Well, I do get a lot of people coming to me all the time now on the internet, and I always have sort of a routine. And what's the number one thing that most people don't have yet, which, that the least amount of time is being put into, it's their drawing ability. The drawing isn't something that comes quickly. It's like the part that I would prefer myself to skip, and I'd rather you come to me after you know how to draw, and then we can talk about painting. That's the number one problem is like I went through 3 years of just drawing, of drawing the figure every day. And when it comes to landscape, it's not quite as rigorous of a problem, but the best landscape painters, they know how to draw. They understand draftsmanship. They understand what they're doing because it's all about design. It's all about shape. So my thing is that a person still first just needs to really get, pretty good at drawing before they just immediately jump into, okay, now I'm done with that. Now I can be a painter. Because to me, painting is still just drawing all the way through. But it sure is nice to kind of just concentrate on that alone before you start getting into all the other aspects of painting. And for me, when I teach, I always teach, there's 4 aspects, the 4 fundamentals. I don't say drawing, I say shapes, and that really goes well with landscape painters, because you may not be having to draw a perfect replica of the tree in front of you, but it better darn be a nice shape. It's all about good and bad shapes in my mind. It's like when I like a painting, it's because the guy really, I keep saying guy, I mean, woman or man, the person has painted a beautiful shaped tree, and they understand what a bad shape is and what a good shape is. And that comes from design, and that comes from an understanding of drawing, and it always goes back to that. But it's shapes, values, edges, and then color. I always say color last, because if you can get those other ones in line, the color will be a lot easier to figure out. But those are the basic fundamentals I always harp on, and shapes is always the first one to try to get across to somebody what is good drawing or good shapes. And it really the hard thing to teach somebody. It's almost innate. You have to almost be able to just recognize it. I do it with my own girls who I'm teaching. I will draw bad shapes and I'll draw good shapes. And which was a good shape and which was a bad shape? See, you know which one it is, but when you do it, do you see it? And that's really probably the thing that I would say is the biggest problem to all of us, which is our blindness, that we don't, what's my biggest problem is not seeing the mistakes and the bad shapes and the things that I'm creating in front of me, because I'm become blind, and I become blind quickly. So we all use mirrors, and we turn it upside down, and we ask other people, and but honestly, you could write a book on just artist blindness. That's got to be probably the number one problem we all end up having.
Yeah, sometimes it's just a matter of putting it away for 6 months or something and coming back to it, seeing it with fresh eyes.
And you hope you're going to see it with fresh eyes. But, I bet I could see it a lot quicker for you, and you could see it a lot quicker for me.
Oh, absolutely.
So how do we bottle that and then sell it to people, right?
Yeah. Well, I've thought about that. I like to bottle things and sell them. Well, what I do is I'll send a picture to a buddy, and I'll say, something's wrong. I just can't see what it is. And they'll point it out immediately. Right.
Yeah. I mean, truthfulness, when you got somebody who's knowledgeable and truthful and not worried about hurting you, that's like the greatest weapon you could have as an artist.
Yeah,
and I have that myself. I have people that will be totally honest with me. And, if I didn't have that, I would feel very vulnerable.
I want to switch gears real quickly before we wrap up and ask about career building. Now, you fell into some really lucky breaks, it sounds like, but probably lucky breaks because you were so talented. You fell into this idea of the posters because you went to the trouble of showing somebody your work and they liked your work. You have become known as one of the preeminent artists in America today. You have a great reputation. I assume your prices are going high. You have a big collector base. Did you have any strategy or thought behind that, or did it just happen?
No, there's a strategy that wasn't all mine. I started off with some people that my gallery and some mentors that were giving me advice as I would continue to have more success. And I had a pretty quick success of people are really liking this and buying it. You better be careful. There's always that, be careful. Don't make these mistakes that other artists have made in the past. So I was given good advice, and one of them was, don't raise your prices right away. Don't feel like, oh my gosh, just because 50 people are trying to buy that same painting, that you ought to double your price now. Because there's a temptation to do all kinds of things when you think everybody loves what you're doing and no matter what will buy it. So I just stayed the course. I just do what you're supposed to do, raise your prices incrementally the way you're supposed to, and don't be thrown off by auction prices or whatever might happen around you. You think the long term and build it slowly and build a collector base that gets excited about you. And that was the kind of advice I was always being given. And the other was that just my own self was believing that, okay, I've got to make sure that I don't feel embarrassed later on of some of these paintings, that got to make sure I always like what I'm doing, make sure that it doesn't leave the studio unless it passes a certain, standard of this is, something I would buy if I was a collector, and it's that it's worthwhile for whatever it is I'm asking. And so what that did was produce less paintings. I don't produce the same number of paintings as a lot of the people that I knew. I wish I could have, but I'm a slower person because of it, because I just become a little bit more like, it doesn't quite, I've got paintings all over the place that I just never released because I thought, still not too sure about it,
Well,
so I would hold back on them, and it seems to have benefited me.
That's what most of the great painters have in mind is that you mentioned George Carlson. George does 3 or 4 paintings a year, but they are amazing, and he puts a lot of time into them, and of course is able to command really incredible prices because of the scarcity. So it sounds like you've been able to do the same thing. And the one thing that, as I teach marketing, that's the one thing you have to keep coming back to is that the quality absolutely has to be there. The truth is that people can sell bad paintings all day long and they'll make a good living doing it, but why would you want to?
Right.
Yeah.
It's true.
Well, Morgan, this has been absolutely fantastic. I'm honored that you would be on the PleinAir podcast, and one day I'll come out to LA once the fires are over, and we'll go plein air painting, and I won't show anybody what you've done.
I have a great place over here, the Vasquez Canyon Rocks. You will absolutely love to paint over there with me. You really would. It's great.
You're on. Well, thank you, sir.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Well, that was a great interview with Morgan Weistling, and I think it was kind of a unique thing because he's a plein air painter by hobby, even though he makes his profession as a studio painter and not using his plein air paintings as much. Remember, the podcast is brought to you by the Plein Air Convention in Santa Fe. Learn more at pleinairconvention.com, and also by the Plein Air Salon Art Competition, pleinairsalon.com. Plein Air movement is red hot, which may be why Plein Air Magazine remains the top representational art magazine sold nationwide at Barnes & Noble. Thank you for making that happen. If you don't have it, pick one up. pleinairmagazine.com for a subscription, or get one at the newsstand. Well, this is always fun. Let's do it again sometime, like next week. Happy New Year to everybody. We'll see you then. I'm Eric Rhodes, publisher and founder of Plein Air Magazine. Remember, it's a big world out there. Go paint it. We'll see you. Bye-bye.